going to look at the similarities and differences between the Cine poem by Lars von Trier and the original Euripidean classic tragic drama. So what we have to begin with, which is really significant, is the difference between obviously the opening sequences and the denouement, or the closing sequences. So we call them OS, right, opening sequence, and CS, closing sequence, particularly when we're looking at the syntax of the filmic language. A lot of what Lars von Trier is doing in this cinematic version is playing with our reader or our spectator subjectivity, or our spectator responses to the work. And mostly he does this by establishing very immediately, clearly, our relationship to the protagonist, to Medea herself. And how he does that is through the narrative devices of setting, place, time, mood, atmosphere, the themes, the characterization, and the symbols and images, just to get us started. We've looked at those in many of the literary, poetic pieces and novels that we've sort of looked at so far, and the early documentary work of Neil Diamond's Real Engine. But really, to grind it out and unpack in the way that we need to now with midterms coming up, we kind of want to look at the work very, very closely. And so obviously it's a very stressful opening sequence when we meet Medea for the first time in Lars von Trier's cinematic poem. And if we just take a really close look at that opening sequence, we're going to establish a few things right off the bat. So let's just, okay, so here we go. We have Medea in close-up, right? Middle close-up to close-up. The camera comes into the frame, and I just want to get rid of the borders, they're really unattractive. Okay, so we see her immediately. Of course, we only have imagined her from the opening of the play. In the opening of the play, we have the servants. We have this mood and atmosphere of fright and terror that's established through the nurses' cries of anguish at the potential about wrath about to unleash from Medea. And her nerves are shot, and she's crying to the elements above, you know, for mercy, because she sees that Medea's losing her proverbial marbles and is about to wreak havoc on the Greek society or community. And what we get is a kind of discussion through another's point of view, as opposed to our direct address from the omniscient camera work, the sort of ideology behind the apparatus itself, coming down onto Medea directly. So it comes in, and you'll watch how this camera moves, it comes in to her only to quickly pull us back into a spiral. That spiral dance of life, that sort of metaphoric or symbolic spiraling down, which is a literal sort of metaphorized understanding of Medea's current anguish or her current situation. So we really get, in a sense, an inadvertent point of view of her. And she's aligned with the very important elements that mark or define her as woman, which is tides, moon, water, all sort of symbols that metaphorically speak to birthing, to children, to menstrual cycles, to all the things that are earthly sort of related for women. And why that becomes really interesting is, of course, because we know that Medea is going to murder her children, and that's going to bring down the ancestral royal family, and that is going to leave Jason not only wounded, but sort of mortally pricked because he dies a fairly ignoble death. So all the lust for power and greed for, prestige and things that Jason lusted after through his royal marriage really come back to bite him in the proverbial ass. So this is a much more dramatic opening sequence from the point of view of the visual cues that von Trier is deliberately setting up, creating that atmosphere of extreme sadness. She's in a sorrowful, deeply sorrowful position here. The water covering her that we're going to look at, the movement of the water, the wind, the isolated, barren landscape, all kind of mirrors for her interior sorrow, and she's literally drowning in her sorrows in this scene. So he really wants to establish from the opening shot what we're contending with in terms of Medea and the potential wrath about to unfold. Whereas we don't really hear or see Medea until a little bit further into the play, where Euripides has her give us a really strong rhetorical speech about the perils of womanhood. And really, in comparison, it's nothing really quite as dramatic. And the music, of course, punctuates the scene in a pretty fairly dramatic way. So let's look at it closely. We also see her characterized from her costume. And the rhythmic cadence or slow movement of von Trier's filming here also physiologically plays on our viewer expectations. So you have her in this kind of cross positioning. You have her being covered by the water, almost submerged in the water eventually, and it's a kind of submergence where I think you almost feel her drowning and suffocating. And she's suffocating under the knowledge that her husband has betrayed her, he's abandoned her, and she's about to be banished and sent into exile out of the country with really very little means. Her characterization, or the way in which I see her clothed here, is really interesting. What would you say about the kind of symbolism or imagery of her dress and the way she's... Gothic. Oh yeah, there's definitely a Gothic element to her. Anybody? What's that?
Bleak.
It's very bleak, which obviously is part of what's the overall atmosphere or mood, right, of this opening sequence. This is a horribly sort of bleak and desperate, violent, hostile, I'd say even cruel sort of setting and atmosphere. But I think also she has this sort of appearance for me, and we can look at her even more closely, where it's almost like she's wearing a skin. The dress is so close to her body, it's almost like she's reptilian, because she's always identified with water, and because we can say metaphorically or symbolically, she's always talking about the murdering of her children to mortally wound her husband. And that's a kind of cold-blooded act, no matter which way you slice it, right? Any mother who would murder her children has to have some heartlessness somewhere, because to be able to do it would be almost, I think, so physically retching and impossible to follow through with that act. And of course, von Trier does an amazing job of showing just how difficult that act was, as opposed to the play, which kind of just makes it a two-dimensional act. The children are two-dimensional, they're cardboard, they're wooden, they're not very remarkable at all. But von Trier really gives the children life, and he shows her interacting with her children, and he shows her loving her children and worried when her child is crying and hurt and tripped over himself, and nurturing that child and doing all the things that we traditionally or conventionally see women do with their children, hopefully. So there's these sort of double-edged sides to the representation of Medea. There's the side of her where we see her as a compassionate, loving, caring, nurturing mother, and then there's the side of her where we see her as a raging, hostile, wrathful, vengeful witch, and I put witch in quotations, mostly because one of her key sort of acts is an act of revenge against the royal family and her husband, which is ironic because he should know the backstory, the mythology of Medea and her helping to slay the fire-breathing dragon, to rid, so that her husband could get the golden fleece, to go to Pelias, to, complete his task, and then only to have Pelias say, well, I didn't really think you'd make it, so now that you've made it, well, I really don't want to give up the throne. And then Medea goes further by having the daughters of Pelias kill their own father. So given this knowledge of Medea, it seems really strange that, Jason wouldn't give his head a shake and go, maybe I should kind of rethink how I'm handling this. Because even that he buys into her rhetoric when she shifts and tells him, oh, I was really not thinking things through, and you're a really remarkable man for your considerations, and why didn't I support you in this, and I'll exile myself, and you keep the children, and I'll give you these beautiful, beautiful symbols of my deep love and appreciation to your new bride, who will now have the objects that were given to me by the sun god Helios, my grandfather. And the thought of that, just Jason buying into it, seems so far-fetched. So this is where we have Euripides kind of falling short of the mark in terms of making his characters somewhat two-dimensional and not very rich, and sort of limited. Whereas Von Trier, I think, tries to humanize Medea, and he tries to show us through the treatment of the death of the children just how struggling and how anxious and how grieving and how much anguish and vexing she has in order to commit this act and to follow through. And if it wasn't for her own son, who's very young, saying, I understand why you're doing this. My father betrayed us, and we don't have much choice. And I support you, Mummy. I mean, that's dramatizing, but he does. He puts the noose around his neck and hangs himself from the dead tree branch. And it's a moment of utter paralysis for me. No matter how many times I've watched Von Trier's film, or I know the body of his work, or I know that he's paying homage to a man who spent a lot of time looking at the representation of women historically, from the burning of witches, from earliest days, William Wyler. I just really never quite bend my head around that scene where the child offers himself as a sacrifice for his mother. And so we have these points of difference, and the opening sequence is one that's extremely important. The other one, and of course she meets Aegeus here right off the hop. So Von Trier has her meet Aegeus right at the beginning. And just watch how that spiraling, all the waves, all the folds, all speak to the foreshadowing of time. And the black can be representative or symbolic, quite simply, of death. She wears black through the whole film until the very end of the film, where she takes off the cap of her hat, and we see this long mane of fairly violent red hair. And we see that womanly aspect of her, because prior to that, she's very androgynous. And so that red, raging passion and anger is sort of let loose. And we wait with her as she waits for the tide to come out. So let's just take a quick look at that final sequence, because they're very different treatments. And there's cross-cutting going on here. So you see again, this vast, barren, this is about as much life as we get in the scene. It's either wind and sand and sea, or we have some prairie grasses and various different windy sort of sequences. Jason comes, he sees his children, he's mortified, and then we cut to this. And this is so isolating and barren and sad. And when we see in the play the final denouement or sequence, what we get in the play is her standing with her two children in a giant chariot, golden chariot that's been sent to her from Helios, with the support of the Corinthian chorus, the Corinthian women. And there she is with her children, and she's hovering over Jason, victorious. The tone, her attitude is one of victory. She seems not to be that remorseful about the death of her children. She plans a great ritual and homage to them in the future. She won't let Jason touch the children, and they have a sort of tete-a-tete of violent words. But in the end, she flies away to Athens victorious in this golden chariot. Whereas here, it's really different. The movement of the pace, so slow. I mean, having to wait for this tide to come in, and then eventually all the sounds. There's so much sound imagery in Von Trier. He uses the sound of the boat being raised by the water, creak, 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 creak. He uses the thumping of the dogs chasing with Jason until they're frothing rabid in the mouth and exhausted. They almost look like they died or are dying. And the cutting, the fast cutting, the editing between those moments really create a racing in us and a tension in us. So the tension in the play, the tensions, and the racing are really quite different from script to screen. And what becomes really interesting about this is that there's a sort of deep irony in her sadness that is mirrored in the way in which her whole life is going to be measured out in these kinds of tides. Waiting. There's nothing left for either of them, really. So these are some of the differences that I would say stand out immediately between the play and the cinematic version, which is the opening sequence and the closing sequence. So you could refer to that in a comparison and contrasting kind of way. The treatment of the children, not only in their death, I mean, they're stabbed off stage, in the private and public difference between the houses, and in the other, they're hung. And it's a much more violent death in some ways to be repeatedly stabbed with a very harsh and blunt object. And if you look at the symbolism in the play, there's constant references to the sword. I'd rather stand on the battlefield and take up the sword than suffer the pains of childbirth. So she really refers to that kind of masculinity and that privilege to have that world and say that you're defending all women as opposed to having to give birth to children, which kind of lends itself to the idea, well, what are we thinking of when we think of the meta-narrative? Like, what is actually beyond the story in terms of authorial control? And I think what we're thinking of and what we need to think of is that Euripides has an agenda. There are two very strong views in the scholarship. One is that Euripides really disliked women, and a lot of people use his biographical background to suggest that because he didn't have very much luck with them. But I wouldn't use that. It wouldn't be relevant. I think what's relevant is the fear of the other. So you have another word for other, right, is subaltern, or what we call unbelonging. So you have Medea as a foreign woman, a foreign element infiltrating the Greek social structure and hierarchy. And as such, she has a very strong voice. And that voice has brought down the ancestral line. So on a meta level, I think Euripides is suggesting that women that are not of the hierarchy of the Greek culture, like the Corinthian women, are potential threats to the social fabric and to community and spirit. And so hell hath no fury, like a woman scorned. We can't have these kind of women around. They'll thwart our social fabric or whatever. So then you have that idea, and you also have the idea that some scholars believe he's really quite a feminist, and he's saying, look at this strong, resourceful sorceress and what women can be and what women are and what women do in the world. And I think that even if he is showing those aspects of woman, he's still showing them as threatening. So that's kind of another level of the piece. And there you have the only moment when she's liberated, ironically, is the moment in the knowledge that her children are dead and there's nothing left. So that's a very highly punctuated irony. And then, of course, he's too weak and impotent to even take his own life. And Von Trier says, you know, he's kind of sunk his own ship, so to speak, because, of course, not only did he break his oath, which is probably the most radical mistake he made, but you can't be dishonored, and he dishonored his wife, and she has to go back and fight for her honor. And of course, infanticide isn't clearly that big of a crime, but so just to even see those differences make for a huge possible thing to write on or respond to or summarize or compare and contrast. The other kinds of things you want to look at, the treatment of the children, which we can talk about, the idea of the ironic gifts, which are gifts of death, the missing chorus. In the cinematic version, there is no Greek cultural overriding collective consciousness or voice, so you only have the kind of chanting when Glouch and the king are killed, through the metaphor of the horse in Von Trier's film, you only have that kind of Jason, 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 and that's about as choral as you get in that film version. But you definitely, the chorus serves such a huge role in playing on our psychology as viewers or readers, and because a play is performative, you're obviously going to have a kind of reaction or a physiological reaction to the performativity of the chorus, which was us, which we were singing in unison and speaking back to both characters. Jason, you shouldn't do this. Medea, don't kill your children, not a good plan. You know, all that kind of stuff. So you have that missing chorus. You also have the treatment of the banishment and the fear of Creon. We don't really get that in the same dramatic way that it is given to us in Von Trier. Von Trier sets this incredible set, which is all, you know, constructed and man-made on purpose, of these really strange death trees and death swamp plants, and you hear the rattling of her poisonous whatever they are. There's some kind of flower or seed, or you hear her rattling them, and you watch her in her sort of swamp world, you know, pulling out these beads that she's going to use, and then they have close-up of the mortar and pestle. So the whole process of Medea creating this poison is so like slowly and arduously followed, and so closely, you know, we're brought into her sorcery that it sort of amplifies our dread, and it creates a very strong atmosphere of dread, and we can kind of feel what Creon's feeling at the same time, because he's very afraid of her, and rightly so. I mean, she just destroys like that the whole royal world and the whole world that everyone's occupying. So there's catharsis there too. There's the noble characterization, the fallen characters. There's the pity and fear that we feel. that sort of cleansing of any kind of dis-ease or some lack of ease. So you have, you know, a lot going on in Von Trier that I think really speaks loudly to a more realistic, ironically realistic sort of understanding of Medea as a human being, and of her being humanized and us being made to feel more sympathetic to a kind of villainous character who commits a heinous crime. I mean, it's not considered criminal to them, but it's certainly to us, it would be a moment of severe criminality. Anyways, if you look back here too, just to recap, when she rises out of the water, and you can just hear it's like a time, you know, it's like time, all the foreshadowing in the music, you know, the ominousness, the foreboding. Everything off screen, the invisibility of what is yet to be brought into play, right? It's very clever. Like, there's a lot of metaphorizing, there's a lot of symbolism. Okay, so it's that moment that I want you to analyze for me. That moment when she comes up out of the water. How does that make you feel, like if you were to respond to it? What kind of device is it? Or devices? How would you read it? What's happening? Anybody?
She sees hope.
You feel that she feels hopeful?
Yeah, that someone is there to listen to her.
Okay, so she's drowning in sorrow. She's suffocating, she's bereft because of the betrayal, and she comes up out of the water with hope.
Yeah,
so it's like a rebirth.
Yeah, because you know when she's all by herself, she's just in the water, right? But then because there's no one to listen to her, no one is there to feel her.
No, that's a great reading. So in that moment, there's some potential for reinventing or reimagining her plight or her situation. And that's exactly what she does. She makes a deal with Aegeus to help him, and he'll help her, right?
Yeah.
But it's sort of made with a little bit of, what would you call it? It's a shitty deal. Like, it's not a good deal, right? Yeah. So that moment is her gasping for air with the potential to live on or move on. Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead.
Can you also say it as a moment of realization of her, like, not giving up and striving for more and thinking of revenge, like plotting something?
She comes up with a plan.
She comes up with a plan, right?
Of
So,
how to move on of all that's going on.
that's right. So that's a great literal reading too. But through this metaphor of water, drowning, sorrow, suffocation, oppressed. She feels oppressed, right?
The water can be metaphor for what she's going through right now, all the pressure.
Right. Like she literally has to.
She swims through it.
Right.
Yeah.
So.
And
Yeah.
she realizes that she has to take necessary steps to come out of it.
I think that mostly that idea of epiphany probably works really well here too. Like, you can call it hope, but it's also that moment of realization where, okay, I've got to find a way through this.
Or
And,
do something.
yeah, exactly. And I've got to be the helmsman of my own ship. I've got to steer this ship. Yeah. Okay, good. Anything else? Yeah.
Yeah, like right after the scene where she gets up, like it shows the boat, and then if you realize the boat, like it has like a cross sign on it.
Yes, there's.
So like there's like a bit. I'd say there's a bit of a religious aspect, like maybe like the powers from above, like.
Oh, there's tons, and I'm really glad that you mentioned that because there's so much Christian symbolism, right? The cross is a constant throughout the entire film, and it's a very sort of look at that kind of pagan sensibility or that idea of something higher that's working here, that is divine, that is intervention, that has nothing to do with the characters themselves. And I think that also speaks to the idea of the gods and the goddesses and that kind of mortal world being expendable, where the immortals are playing on the earthly realm, which is part of what we've looked at. And I think Von Trier captures that really beautifully. Yeah. Anything else you want to comment on about anything in relation?
Can you say then, like, if it's religious wise, then that's revelation, like?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'm not big on absolutes. I'm just saying absolutely to say I absolutely agree with you. There's no absolute right or wrong. There's just your reading, as long as you can find textual evidence or some way in which to use the literary devices or narrative devices or the meta-narrative work of Euripides or Von Trier to show how these things are working in you in terms of spectator subjectivity. You can't say anything wrong, right? So it's how you read the story. So let me ask you then, based on this, because this is the big question, and based on these differences that you see from script to screen, and there are many other versions, this just happens to be one of the ones that I really enjoy because I really love visual imagery and filmic stuff, but more visual poetry. So like in terms of the response that I asked you to write, how did you feel that the characterization of Medea or Jason were or were not more sympathetic from script to screen? Did you have any position on that? I mean, based even on this idea of the opening sequence, do you feel, and the closing sequence, do you feel you're more aligned with Medea than you are with Jason? Do you feel that Von Trier wants you to feel more sympathetic toward Medea? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I believe that they want us to be more sympathetic with Medea because it clarifies the fact that Jason did not fully go for the princess because of his family, but he went for his own selfish reasons.
So you think that's firmly established in Von Trier?
Yeah.
Well, I think by having a 13-year-old prepubescent girl as your bride, that's possibly not the reason, the main motivation, that he would discard his existing wife and child for love for her.
That's
for power and
love for the crown.
Well, that's what I mean. So he tells Glauch, I love you, not Medea, because of course Glauch is very jealous and very anxious to have Medea removed. And he knows Medea's powers. He knows what Medea is about. And I think it's clear to Jason that he's actually very lustful for Medea still. And the beach sequence is very clearly kind of indicative of that kind of violent love where he wants her and knows her and shares his life with her, but wants to be rid of her because of what power she appears to have over him, and the fear of that in his own personal life. You could maybe read it differently, but he's very aggressive and violent toward her. He throws her off, and I think he slaps her, or yeah, and resents her for his own desire for her, right? His own desire for her. So it's Glauch, it's not about love at all. So that's why the lesson, that the moral that's undergirding here at the end for Jason is that he dies an ignoble death. He doesn't have the wherewithal to take his own life because he's a coward, is what is being suggested by Von Trier. And that, you know, he's hit mythologically on the head with an oar that kills him from the boat, the sailing Argo that he initially had himself built. So all of those things. What other things do we need to think about before we can kind of go? I think the emotional anguish that makes Medea a more rounder figure is better served or better revealed in the filmic version for sure, because when you see her clutching the sand and gasping and you hear all these different kinds of descriptive and sensorial imageries, you really feel the vexing that she's undergoing or going under, the suffering. Are you more sympathetic to Medea in the film version? How
Yes.
many? No? Does anybody here like violently feel differently? I mean, violently, I'm just exaggerating, but you don't like Medea in the Von Trier version?
Even if you do feel sympathy for her, you have to accept the fact that she did kill her two sons. And as a mother, she can't do that. I think she's not supposed to do that. We're not used to seeing a mother who's so cruel and who's more driven into her own selfishness, into winning something. And she gave up her son to win over Jason.
Okay, well, that's interesting. The fact of the matter is that she had to kill Glouch and the king, and by killing them, her children are already dead. That foreshadows the death of her children. Infanticide, and you can't forget this cultural reality, is not considered a crime. It's considered her regaining her honor. And often, like in Oedipus the King, the child is at birth from the oracle told to be put on the hillside and left to die as an infant. I mean, it's not things we can bend our head around in the 21st century. But certainly, understanding that, we can say to ourselves, well, we know from Von Trier's representation of her as a human person that it wasn't easy for her to commit this crime at all. In the play, it seems Euripides treats it as though it's something she gleefully wants to do. Look at the messenger. We see the messenger. He gives us all the points of view of everyone in the palace. He shows us that the tone at first is they think it's truce, they think it's cause for celebration, everybody's happy, and then chaos, just like that, spinning out of control, spiraling. Glouch gets pissed off. She then is coerced into believing this is a good thing. Then we see her conceits and her vanity at work, and then, you know, Jason assuages her, and then all of a sudden she puts on these gifts of death, and we see the most gruesome, grotesque, horrific, cruel murder. I mean, Medea could have poisoned her, but she didn't have to poison her so that she starts burning from within and frothing at the mouth, and her eyeballs start popping out, and all these different things that are happening. And then her father tries to grab her, and then his skin meshes to hers, and then it's pulling out skin apart. And I mean, it's incredibly gothic, grotesque, gruesome, and all the time the messenger's expressing how much Medea is taking pleasure in the storytelling. We don't have that same representation of her in Von Trier. And then we also, and which points back to the ways in which distorted myths about goddesses or sorceresses or witches have gone on for time immemorial, with Medusa and Pandora, for example, the ones that I gave you before, where they're not these negative representations, but they've been made into negative representations to support the Euripidean view that women that don't follow the policy or company line or whatever you want to put it should be punished or should be kept out of the Republic. Just like Plato says, banish all poets, get rid of foreign subalterns that are going to turn our men into, what's a good expression? You know, yeah. So, okay. I think we have enough there for now. Yeah, go ahead.
There's another, like, I'd say there's another difference in the play and the film. I'd say in the play they're trying to show more of, like, the revenge part, but else in the film they're trying to, like showing like Medea is trying to go into stereotype of women, that like women are like slaves and all. And I'd say this is like based on like camera angles in the movie.
Yeah.
And like it showed there's like the scene like where Medea is in the beach, and then you can see the castle on top. It's like on the hill.
That's right.
Like,
Yeah.
like the castle's on top and she's at the bottom.
At the bottom.
And then like, and then when she wants to like what's it called like she wants to like get rid of her children, like the tree is on top of a hill.
Right.
So she's trying to show like you guys are up there, I can go up there as well.
Okay, so
You
you're
know?
playing with hierarchies through frames and visual reading. That's
Yeah.
great. Yeah. I also think that she and the boat does the same thing.
Yeah.
The boat waits for the tide, and then the boat slowly raises, and then and she's very liberated in the play version, but she doesn't seem very happy at all. In like what she sees as her future appears to be incredibly grief-stricken in the final sequence. And then I think it's a great pun when the sail comes down and it's like the final curtain, which puns on the ending. Like there's nowhere to go after that. And you can see that sense of unbelonging in something like Frankenstein as well, where he has to fight in a circular way, in this spiraling way, the creature chasing his own creator and the creator chasing his creature, and this barren landscape, it's literally ice, so you have that metaphor again, to show the inner workings, but it's also that the noble intention of wanting to create life and the male giving birth mythology gets so perverted into this sort of creature that's born. And I mean, most of what we're going to see in the next little while are a lot of representations of children that are orphaned, neglected, abandoned, children used as pawns to win in a game of economics and love and war between couples who have been spurned and betrayed. That's what Gone Girl is all about. You see Amy actually using her pregnancy to trap Nick, which seems so ironically the antithesis of what we really normally see couples wanting to do. Like, you don't have children to trap your husband generally, right? Or that sort of old stereotype of women that get pregnant to deliberately keep a man. These kinds of things are being fleshed out and literally by women a lot of the time too, like that want to. Gillian Flynn is writing Gone Girl, and she's getting a lot of flack and a lot of controversy around representing women characters in negative, what appears to be negative ways. There's not one real character that you can identify with and sympathize with. She didn't permit any tokenism. Nick, when we come to see Nick, he's just a character who is pathetic. He's like this hack writer that can't get work, that plays video games and board games all day, that his wife supports with a bar. They're really sad, pathetic characterizations of men, to be honest with you too. There's not very many good representations, but yet the children are always the ones throughout this sort of thread of unbelonging that suffer, and it's always these gothic female monsters or gothic monsters. I mean, the monster himself, when he was born without any coding. He was thrown into the symbolic, and he had no father and no teacher and nobody to help guide him except the family of the forest, right? So you can't really say that he's responsible, and that kind of notion of responsibility or accountability becomes another thematic for most of these marginalized figures, right? Okay, good work. Yeah.
You mentioned about Jason. He didn't take his life because he was too coward to do it.
Well, that's one possible reading.